start. Hi everyone. I do a bedtime story nearly every day for either David or me, for Amelia. So today I'm doing a story, and I think many of you know it's The Man Who Planted Trees by Giono. I'm actually going to read it from my laptop, because I thought I was going to do this live stream from the laptop, and I thought it would work better if I was reading from the laptop. But I'm actually connected to you via my mobile phone, and I hope it's going to work, because my phone is a little bit broken. So it's just the heads up, if we cut up, it's because of the mobile phone. I chose The Man Who Planted Trees because it's a very important book to me. It's a very short story, and it's a story that captured my imagination, and also, like many of you, I have been concerned with climate crisis and felt very hopeless in this crisis. But this book gives us a lot of hope, and is about the power of one person. I think if everyone follows their dream, maybe we can change the climate crisis path. And with that, I wanted to talk about a couple of other books I have been reading recently. I think this is a really nice book to read, to sort of awaken one's dreams and in relation to wilding. And in the recent years, I'm currently reading Feral by Monteiro, which I strongly recommend. Is a absolutely wonderful, very insightful book. And prior to that, I finished a book called Wilding, which is about the rewilding or the rewilding of the Knepp estate in Sussex, which is also a very interesting book. More recently, I've been reading this book too, called Edgerow, and I bought this book last Christmas, and it's also quite a nice book. It's a book about written by someone called Paul Wood, which is reimagining London as a forest, and it has an interesting beginning. Kind of defines that London is defined as a forest, yeah. So I'm going to start with the book. It's a book that it's almost like a folk tale, but it's not a folk tale. And it's a book that when it was written, it was quite controversial because some people thought it was a real story. It's not a real story, but I think everyone would hope for it to be. So without further ado, I'm going to start the story of The Man Who Planted Trees by Giono. Many years ago, I set out in a walking tour high in the Alps, in a region quite unknown to travellers, where ancient mountains thrust down into Provence. The trek began on barren moors between 1,200 and 1,300 metres above sea level. Through a land that was bleak and monotonous, nothing grew there but wild lavender. My route led across the region at its widest point, and after hiking for 3 days, I found myself in a wasteland, desolate beyond description. I made camp near the remains of an abandoned village. The day before, my water supply had run out, and I had to find some. The cluster of houses, although they were in ruins, reminded me of a old wasp's nest, made me think that once there there must have been a fountain, or perhaps a well. There was indeed a fountain, but it was dry. The roofless houses eaten away by wind and rain, and the chapel with its crumbling belfries stood arranged like houses and churches in a living village. But here life had vanished. It was a sunny, cloudless June day, but over the bare highlands blew a fierce, insufferable wind. Growling through skeletons of houses, it sounded like a wild beast disturbed while feeding on its prey. I had to move camp. After 5 hours of walking, I still had found no water, and I could see nothing that gave me the hope of finding any. Everywhere I came upon the same drought, the same coarse weeds. In the distance, something caught my eye. A dark shape that looked like a street stump, but just in case I walked towards it. It was a shepherd, and beside him, resting on a burning ground, lay about 30 sheep. He let me drink from his gourd, and then guided me to his sheepfold in a hollow in a plain. He drew water, excellent water too, from a very deep natural well, over which he had rigged a simple windlass. This man spoke very little, often the way with people leave alone, but he appeared sure of himself, and confident in his assurance. It all seemed somehow strange in its barren land. He lived not in a hut, but in a real house, a stone house, whose walls clearly showed his own labour and repairs, the aged ruin it had once been. Its roof was solid and strong, and the wind on its tiles sounded like the sea upon a seashore. Inside it was neat and tidy, dishes washed, floor swept, shotgun oil. His soup simmered over the fire, and I noticed that he was freshly shaved, that all its buttons were firmly sewed on, and its clothes were damned with meticulous care, which makes the mend invisible. He shared his soup with me. When I offered my tobacco pouch, he told me he did not smoke. The dog, silent like his master, was friendly without fawning. It had been agreed that I could spend the night. The nearest village was still almost 2 days' walk away. Villages in these regions were few and far between, and I knew well what they were like. 4 or 5 of them were scattered over the slopes of these highlands, each one at the very end of a cart track, among copses of white trees. They were inhabited by charcoal burners. The leaving was poor, families huddled together in a climate very harsh in the summer and winter. Both found struggle for survival made more bitter by their isolation. There was no relief. The constant longing to escape became a crazy ambition. Endlessly, the men carted their charcoal to town and returned home. Even the more stable characters cracked under such constant grind. The shepherd did not smoke. He went to fetch a little sack, and on the table he emptied a pile of acorns. He began to examine them very carefully, one by one, separating the good from the bad. I sat smoking my pipe. I offered to help, but he told me it was his work, and indeed, seeing how very carefully he carried out his task, I did not insist. That was the only time we spoke. When he set aside enough acorns, he divided them into piles of 10. As he did these, he discarded the smaller ones, or those that were cracked. For now he was examining very closely when finally he laid before him 100 perfect acorns. He stopped. We went to our beds. Being with his man brought a great sense of peace. The following morning I asked him if I might stay on and rest for a day. He found that quite naturally, and to be more precise, he gave me the impression that nothing could upset him. The day of rest wasn't absolutely necessary, but I was intrigued. I wanted to learn more about him. He let his sheep out of the pen and led them to their grazing. Before he went, he took a little bag of carefully chosen acorns and put them into a pail of water to soak. I noticed that for a walking staff, he carried an iron rod as thick as my thumb and about as high as my shoulder. Pretending to take a leisurely walk, I followed him at a distance by keeping on a parallel path. The pasture for his sheep was down in a dell. Leaving his dog in charge of the little flock, he began to climb towards me. I feared that he was coming to reproach me, but not at all. It happened to be on his way, and he invited me to go with him if I had nothing better to do. He was going a little further to the top of the hill. When he reached his destination, he began to drive his iron staff into the ground, and he made a hole and dropped in an acorn and filled in the hole. He was planting oak trees. I asked him if he owned the land. He said no. Did he know who owned it? He did not. He thought it was common land, parish property, or perhaps it belonged to people who did not care about it. That did not concern him. And so, with infinite care, he planted his 100 acorns. After the midday meal, he began to sort more acorns. I suppose I must have been quite insistent with my questions because he answered me. For 3 years, he had been planting trees in a desolate country. He had planted 100,000. Of 100,000, 20,000 had come up. Of these, he is still expecting to lose half, either to rodents or to any unpredictable things which only Providence can account for. That left 10,000 oaks to grow on this tract of land where before there was nothing. It was then that I wondered about the man's age. He was clearly more than 50, 55 he told me. His name was Elzar Boffier. He had owned a farm down in the lowlands. It had been his life. He had lost his only son and then his wife, and had withdrawn into this solitude, where he was content to live quietly with lambs and a dog. It was of his opinion that the land was dying for the lack of trees. He added that having nothing more important to do himself, he had resolved to remedy the state of affairs. I was young, and only thought of the future as it affected me and my search for happiness. So I told him that in 30 years those 10,000 oaks would be magnificent. He answered me quite simply that if God granted him life, in 30 years he would have planted so many more, that these 10,000 would be a drop of water in the sea. Already he was studying the growth of beech trees, and had a nursery full of seedlings grown from beech huts. They were quite beautiful, and he was thinking of birches for the dales. He told me there was moisture just below the surface of the soil. The next day we parted. The following year came the First World War, in which I was engaged for 5 years. An infantryman was hardly likely to have trees on his mind. After demobilization, I found myself the possessor of a small gratuity and a great desire to breed pure hair. This was my only thought when I set off once more on the road to the barren lands. The country had not changed. However, in the distance beyond the desert village, I noticed a sort of grey mist that laid on the hilltops like a carpet. The shepherd who planted trees had been in my mind since the day before. 10,000 oak trees, I thought to myself, really need a lot of space. I'd seen so many people die those 5 years. It was easy to imagine that Elsa at Bouffier too was dead, especially since at 20 we think of men of 50 ancient with nothing left to do but die. He was not dead. He had changed his occupation. He had only 4 sheep left, but now he had 100 hives. He had given up sheep because they threatened his young trees. The oaks of 1910 were now 10 years old, and later, and taller than either of us. It was such an impressive sight, I was struck dumb. As he never said a word, we spent the whole day in silence, walking through his forest. It was in 3 sections and measured 11 kilometers long and 3 kilometers at its widest. When I reminded myself that all this was the work of and the hand of one soul with no mechanical help, it seemed to me that men could be as effective as God in tasks other than destruction. He had followed his dream, and he showed me his handsome groves. This was the most impressive effect of creation natural cycle that I'd never seen before. Among the miserable villages I went before, some were built in sites of ancient Roman villages, and archaeologists digging in the ruins had found fish hooks, whereas in the 20th century cisterns were needed to ensure even a modest supply of water. The wind scattered seeds too, and as the water reappeared, so did willow trees, reeds, meadows, gardens, flowers, and reason for living. But the change had come about so gradually that it was simply taken for granted. Of course, hunters that searched these heights I've lost my track. That is why no one meddled with the work before the shepherd. Had they suspected it was the work of a man, they would have interfered. But who would even think of him? Who in the villages or among the authorities could ever imagine such constant, magnificent generosity? Each year from 1920 on, I paid a visit to Elsa Bouffier. I never saw him lose heart, nor was he deterred, and often, God knows, it must have seemed like heaven itself was against him. I never tried to imagine his frustrations, but to achieve such an end, he must have had to overcome many obstacles. For such passion to succeed, he must have fought and conquered despair. We must remember that this spectacular man had worked in utter solitude so complete that towards the end of his life he had lost the habit of speech, or perhaps he saw no need for it. In 1933, he was visited by an astonished forester. It was the first time the forester told him naively that he had never seen a forest grow on its own. In 1935, a whole delegation from authorities arrived to look at the natural forest. There was a high-ranking official from the forestry department and an elected member of parliament, technical experts, and there was a great deal of talk. It was decided that something must be done. Fortunately, nobody did anything, except for one good thing. The forest was placed under government protection and charcoal burning was prohibited. It was really impossible not to be enchanted by the beauty of these healthy trees. They even managed to cast their spell over the Member of Parliament. One of the senior foresters in the delegation was a friend of mine, and I explained to him the mystery. The following week, we both set out to find Ezel. He was hard at work, about 20 kilometers from where the official inspection had taken place. I was right about my friend, the forester. He was able to appreciate all he saw. I offered the eggs I had brought as a present, and we shared our lunch and sat several hours in silence, contemplation of the landscape. The slope we had climbed on our way up was covered with tall trees 4 times our own height. I remember how it looked in 1913, desolate. He was one of God's athletes. I wondered how many more hectares he would cover with trees. The only serious dangers to his work occurred during the Second World War. Cars being powered by wood-burning generators, there was never enough wood. Cutting began amongst oaks of the 1910s, but they were so far from transportation routes that the whole enterprise proved financially unsound, and it was abandoned. The shepherd knew nothing of all of these. He was 30 kilometers quietly going about his business, ignoring the war of 1939, just as he had ignored the war in 1914. I saw Elsa for the last time in June of 1945. He was then 87. Again, I had set out on the road to the barren moors, but now, in spite of the dislocation left behind the war, there was a bus which ran from Durance Valley into up the mountains. I decided it must be because of the relatively speed of means of transport that I could not recognize the places where my walks used to lead me. I took the name of the villages to reassure me that I really was in the region that had once been desolate and abandoned. The bus dropped me at Verbans in 1913. This hamlet of no more than a dozen houses had 3 inhabitants, wild creatures who hated each other, who snared to make a living. They were people without hope. Now everything was different. Even the air itself. Instead of the harsh, dry winds of the past, there was a gentle breeze full of fragrance. From the mountain tops came a sound like a rushing of water. It was the wind rustling through the forest, and then, even more astonishing, I heard another sound of water. I saw they had built a fountain that splashed merrily beside it. What I found most touching, someone had planted a linden tree, the perfect symbol of rebirth. From this point I continued on foot. The war had not been long enough for life to be reaching full bloom. On the lower slopes of the mountain I could see a small of young barley and rye, and down the narrow valleys the meadows were green. It's taken only 8 years since then for all the countryside to glow with health and prosperity. Where I had seen ruins in 1913, there was now standing clean, fresh, plastered houses, evidence of happy, comfortable lives, dry spring fed by snow and rains, now conserved by forests, have begun to flow again. In maple groves, each farm has its fountain brimming one onto carpets of fresh mint. Bit by bit, the villages have been rebuilt. People have come to settle. They brought young life and the spirit of adventure. On the road, one meets people glowing with health and boys and girls laughing as they enjoy their rustic pleasures. Counting those who leave when I think that one man, one body and one spirit sorry. When I think that one man, one body and one spirit was enough to turn a desert into land of a cannon. That a man's destiny can be truly wonderful. But when I consider the passionate determination and the unfailing generosity of a spirit it took to achieve this end, I'm filled with admiration. Elsa Bouffier died in Bannon in 1947. Thank you. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. I hope you enjoy the story. I think it's a very hopeful story. I think it touches many of us. Thank you for joining us.